The night was darker than usual, a silence hanging heavy over the deserted valley where the unit had set camp, the kind of silence that spoke louder than thunder, the kind that made every soldier's chest rise and fall in uneasy rhythm because they knew something was coming, though no one could yet say from where. Among them stood Captain Armin, a man who had seen enough wars to know that the air itself often carried warnings before bullets did, and yet even with all his years of experience he could not shake the sensation that tonight was different, that tonight demanded a choice far heavier than any order he had ever obeyed, and while the other men tightened their boots, checked their rifles, and exchanged half-hearted jokes to keep fear at bay, Armin's eyes stayed fixed on the narrow ridge across the valley, the only passage through which an enemy ambush could storm down, and as he looked he recalled his mother's words from long ago, words she had spoken when he was just a boy. Running barefoot across their village fields, sometimes the greatest courage is not in the fight, but in the moment you decide what fight is worth taking. Those words had never left him, echoing through the years like an unseen compass, guiding him through battles, losses and commands, but tonight they carried a weight he had never truly felt, for beyond that ridge 6 of his men, his responsibility, his family in uniform, had been sent to scout a reported hideout, and minutes earlier their signal had gone dead, their radio silence striking like a knife in the chest, and though protocol demanded he wait for higher command to decide something inside him burned with urgency, a fire telling him that waiting would not just mean lost time, it would mean lost lives, yet to act without order was to risk court-martial, disgrace, even being called a traitor to discipline. His mind raced as he gripped his weapon tighter, feeling the cold steel press against his palm like a reminder that every life connected to his decision now weighed upon his trigger finger, and just then the colonel himself emerged from the command tent, a stern figure with sharp eyes and a reputation for valuing rules above all else, his voice carrying across the quiet camp as he barked, "No one moves until I say so." The men froze, their gazes flicking between him and Armin, sensing the storm of conflict rising, but in Armin's chest the storm had already broken, and he saw in his mind a picture too vivid to ignore. His 6 men captured, tortured, executed one by one while he stood waiting for permission that would never come in time, and in that instant he knew the only path left, the path that would either save them or condemn him. He pulled the bolt of his rifle, the metallic click slicing through the air like a defiance of authority, and in that sound the entire camp turned toward him, their breaths held, their loyalty torn between fear of the colonel and respect for the captain who had always led them through fire. The colonel's voice roared again, "Stand down, Captain. That is an order." But Armin's legs moved of their own accord, his boots striking the earth with determination, carrying him toward the ridge as if every step was written in fate, and with each stride the weight of his choice grew heavier yet strangely freeing, for he realized that to live as a soldier was not simply to obey, it was to bear the unbearable responsibility of others' lives, even when authority refused to see the urgency. By the time he reached the narrow ledge where the ridge began, the sounds of muffled struggle drifted faintly through the night air, choked cries, scuffles, the thud of bodies and the guttural voices of enemy fighters, sounds that twisted his insides into knots, fueling his resolve, and as he raised his rifle he knew that a single shot, one pull of the trigger, would not only declare war upon those holding his men but also declare war upon the chains of rigid command that sought to hold him. He inhaled slowly, the air sharp in his lungs, his finger brushing the cold curve of the trigger, his mind flashing with images of every face he might lose tonight, and then with a steadiness that surprised even him he squeezed. The crack of the bullet shattered the silence, echoing through the valley like thunder made of steel, and in that one sound 6 fates shifted, for the shot struck true, piercing the hand of the guard who held a knife to the throat of one of Armin's men, the blade clattering harmlessly to the ground as the captive soldier seized the moment to fight back. Chaos erupted instantly, shouts and gunfire filling the air, but Armin did not retreat, he surged forward, his rifle blazing, each shot fired with precision born not from training alone but from the burning oath within him that no man under his command would be abandoned. Behind him, the colonel had rushed to the ledge with furious disbelief, his eyes wide not merely from the defiance but from the sight unfolding. 6 soldiers, once helpless and moments from death, now fighting with renewed strength as Armin's intervention gave them the opening they needed, and though bullets tore the night, though the valley roared with violence, hope had returned where only despair had lived moments before. The colonel stood speechless, his mouth open as if to issue another command but no words came, for how could he deny the truth before him, that a single forbidden act, a single disobedient trigger pull, had achieved what all his waiting could not? Armin pressed on, his body a blur of motion, weaving between rocks and shadows, calling out to his men with the kind of voice that pulled them not just into formation but into courage, his presence igniting them into unity, and together they fought back, inch by inch reclaiming the night from enemy hands. When at last the gunfire waned, when the valley once again fell into heavy silence, 6 men stood alive where 6 corpses had nearly lain, their chests heaving, their eyes shining with the raw gratitude of those who had been granted a second chance at life, and all of them turned to Armin, their captain, their savior, while high above on the ledge the colonel remained frozen, the weight of his authority crumbling beneath the undeniable power of what he had witnessed. And though Armin did not look back, though he did not seek approval or forgiveness, the truth hung in the air as clear as the stars above. Sometimes one pull of the trigger did not begin a war. It saved the souls who would have been its casualties. The valley still smelled of gunpowder, smoke lingering in the cold air like the ghost of the battle that had just ended, and those 6 men stood alive because of one defiant choice. Captain Armin's heart carried no victory, only the heavy beat of consequence, for he knew that saving lives tonight had also lit a fuse with the colonel that could not be extinguished easily, yet as he watched his men stagger back toward camp, some bleeding, some limping, but all breathing, he felt an unshakable calm that told him whatever storm awaited from command was worth enduring, because nothing compared to the look in their eyes when they realized they still had a tomorrow, still had a chance to write letters to families, still had laughter left in them, and that gift was priceless. The colonel descended slowly from the ledge, his boots grinding on the gravel, his face carved from stone, every line sharp with restrained fury, but beneath the mask there was something else too, something unsettled, as though what he had just witnessed was challenging the very foundations of the discipline he had lived by for decades, and when he finally reached the men, silence fell heavier than the smoke, each soldier waiting, every chest tight with anticipation of what punishment or praise might come, but the colonel said nothing at first, he merely stared at Armin, his eyes narrowing, his lips pressed tight, the silence stretching long enough to make even the strongest hearts falter. Armin met his gaze without flinching, his rifle still warm in his grip, his uniform stained with the dirt and blood of the rescue, and though he felt exhaustion pulling at his limbs, he stood tall, not out of pride but out of unyielding belief in the choice he had made, and in that locked gaze between superior and subordinate the entire camp felt the clash of 2 worlds, one ruled by rules, the other by responsibility. At last the colonel spoke, his voice low but edged with steel, "You disobeyed a direct order, Captain." The words cut through the air like a blade, and though every man knew them to be true, not one could look at Armin with blame, for the evidence of his defiance stood breathing beside them, 6 lives that should have been gone but weren't. Armin did not reply immediately. He let the words hang, let them echo against the silence, and then with a voice steady as the mountains he answered, "I saved my men, sir." Simple words, but heavy with unspoken meaning, and though they were spoken with respect, they carried defiance too, for they declared that to him, the lives of those soldiers outweighed protocol, outweighed fear, outweighed his own career. The colonel's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides, his silence louder than shouting, and then he turned abruptly, ordering the medics to tend to the wounded, his voice cracking like a whip across the camp. Yet even as he gave commands his eyes flicked once more to Armin, a flicker of something unreadable within them, anger perhaps but also doubt, perhaps even admiration he dared not admit. The night wore on as the soldiers settled, some collapsing from exhaustion, some murmuring prayers of thanks, but in every corner of the camp whispers rose, whispers about the captain who had pulled the trigger that saved 6, whispers that traveled like fire through dry grass, until even the quietest men felt their hearts stir with a dangerous kind of hope, hope that leadership could mean more than blind obedience, that courage could sometimes be found in the refusal to wait for permission. Armin did not bask in their gratitude, he sat apart, his back against a rock, his rifle across his lap, his thoughts heavy, for he knew tomorrow would not forgive tonight, that the colonel's silence was not mercy but calculation, and that soon he would be called to answer for his defiance. Yet despite the weight, he felt no regret. He remembered the faces of his men as they rose from the edge of death, the relief in their eyes, the trembling hands that had gripped his arm in thanks, and he knew no punishment could outweigh that. Near dawn the colonel finally approached him again, his shadow stretching long in the pale light, and the men nearby held their breaths as though expecting the crack of thunder, but instead of fury the colonel's voice came quiet, almost strained, "You risked everything for them. Do you even realize what you've done?" Armin looked up, his face tired but unyielding, and replied softly, "I realize, sir. I chose to carry their lives, not their deaths." The colonel's eyes lingered on him, searching for weakness, for apology, but finding none, only the steady fire of a man who had already accepted the cost, and for the first time in years the colonel felt the foundation of his certainty shake, for how could a man be so willing to throw away career, honor and safety for others, and still stand so calm? He turned away sharply, muttering something about preparing a report, but the soldiers who had been listening would never forget the look in his eyes, the look of a leader confronted not with insubordination but with a truth too raw to dismiss. That morning when the sun finally rose over the valley, it revealed not just a camp of tired men but a camp divided by questions of loyalty and courage, and though no one said it openly, everyone knew a storm was brewing, a storm not of bullets but of decisions that would ripple through every man's soul. Armin rose with the sun, his shoulders squared, his body aching yet his spirit ironclad, ready to face whatever consequences came, for he had made peace with his choice the moment he pulled the trigger, but deep within him he also felt something stirring, a quiet anticipation that perhaps what happened last night was not just about saving 6 men, it was about changing something larger, something unspoken in the very heart of command. The colonel's report to headquarters was written with the precision of a blade, every word sharp and cold, listing Captain Armin's defiance as a breach of military code, his action as insubordination, his trigger pull as disobedience, yet even as the colonel's pen carved accusations on the paper his hand trembled ever so slightly, for each sentence stood in contradiction to the images still burning in his mind of 6 soldiers walking back alive from the edge of death, their eyes shining with gratitude that had nothing to do with him, and though he fought to bury the memory beneath the armor of discipline, it returned again and again like an echo refusing silence. Days passed and the camp grew restless, not with enemy threats but with the invisible tension that stretched like wire between the colonel and Armin, every soldier sensing it though no one dared speak it aloud, and yet in the quiet moments when men sat cleaning their rifles or sharing meals in hushed tones, the whispers always returned, "He saved them. He risked everything, 1 trigger, 6 lives." Until the story became larger than the event itself, a tale that inspired awe and doubt in equal measure. Armin carried himself as he always had, steady, disciplined, attentive to his duties, yet everyone could see the unspoken wall between him and the colonel, a wall built not of hatred but of clashing truths, and while the colonel enforced drills with unrelenting strictness, the men obeyed but their loyalty tilted, subtle yet undeniable, toward the captain whose courage had crossed forbidden lines. The breaking point came sooner than expected when orders arrived from command. The unit was to advance deeper into hostile territory, a region known as the Silent Pass, where narrow cliffs strangled movement and enemy ambushes thrived like vultures waiting for prey, and though the colonel read the orders aloud with his usual calm authority, the men exchanged glances heavy with dread, for they knew the pass was less a mission and more a gamble with death. That evening, as plans were drawn and maps spread on rough wooden tables, the colonel laid out his strategy, strict, methodical, by the book, yet as Armin listened he felt unease coil in his gut, for the colonel's plan relied too heavily on predictable routes the enemy would certainly anticipate, and though Armin's mind urged him to speak, he held his tongue, knowing that challenging the colonel openly in front of the men would only deepen the fracture already bleeding through their ranks. Later, under the veil of night, some of the younger soldiers approached him quietly, their voices trembling but filled with trust. "Captain, what do you think? Do you believe his plan will work?" Armin looked at their faces, saw the fear behind their questions, and though every instinct screamed to reassure them, he could not lie. Instead he told them, "Fear is natural but courage is choosing to move despite it. Follow orders but keep your eyes sharp. The enemy waits for certainty, give them none." His words spread through the camp like a hidden current, not undermining authority but planting seeds of vigilance, seeds that might bloom when the moment came. At dawn they marched, boots striking the frozen ground in grim rhythm, rifles slung across weary shoulders, eyes darting to the cliffs above where shadows played tricks, and every man knew that the pass was not silent at all. It was listening, watching, waiting. Hours stretched into eternity as the narrow path wound deeper, cliffs rising like jagged teeth around them, and though the colonel marched with rigid confidence at the front, Armin walked a few paces behind, his gaze scanning every rock, every hollow, his mind calculating possibilities, and when a pebble clattered unnaturally down from above, too deliberate, too timed, he felt his breath hitch. He knew. The ambush came like lightning, enemy fire raining down from the cliffs, explosions shaking the ground, men shouting, scattering for cover, and in the chaos the colonel barked orders, trying to maintain formation, but his commands were drowned in the storm of bullets and fear. Armin acted without hesitation, his voice cutting through the thunder, rallying men into cover, directing suppressive fire with precision, and though his actions were again a breach of strict hierarchy, the soldiers instinctively followed him, for in the whirlwind of survival they trusted the man who had already proven he would risk everything for them. Crawling between jagged rocks, Armin spotted the enemy positions, elevated and fortified, raining death upon his men, and he knew the colonel's rigid plan had given their attackers the perfect advantage. To continue obeying orders was to bleed slowly into the dirt. His mind raced, weighing options until his eyes caught a narrow fissure in the cliffside, a path almost invisible, steep and dangerous, but one that could flank the enemy stronghold. He turned to a small group of soldiers nearby, men whose eyes mirrored his own urgency, and without waiting for permission he led them toward the fissure, climbing with grit and desperation, bullets whizzing past, rocks crumbling beneath their boots, every step a gamble between death and deliverance. Above, the enemy fighters shouted, unaware that death was climbing toward them, and when Armin finally pulled himself onto the ledge, chest heaving, rifle raised, he wasted no breath. His shots cut swift and sharp, dropping guards before they could cry alarm, and his men surged behind him, storming the position with raw fury. Within minutes the enemy fire faltered, confusion spreading among their ranks as their advantage crumbled, and below in the valley the colonel looked up in shock to see the tide turning not by his plan but by the captain's reckless initiative. The battle ended with the enemy retreating, their dead scattered across the rocks, and silence returned once more to the pass, though this silence was heavy with victory earned at a cost of shattered rules. The soldiers gathered, panting, battered, some wounded, yet alive, their gazes drawn not to the colonel but to Armin, their voices rising in murmured praise, gratitude, loyalty, and though Armin offered no speech, no boast, his presence spoke louder than words. Leadership was not in orders shouted from safety, it was in the blood-stained hands that pulled men back from the brink. The colonel stood apart, his face pale beneath the grime, his eyes fixed on the captain, and for the second time in days he found himself without words, his authority hollow in the echo of a truth he could not deny, that discipline had not saved them here, courage had, and the man who had defied him twice had become the axis upon which their survival turned. The silent pass behind them, the unit marched into the open plains beyond, their bodies weary but their spirits strangely alive, for though death had brushed against them once more, it had been pushed back by the courage of one man who chose instinct over order, yet with each step forward the invisible chasm between Colonel Rahman and Captain Armin deepened, the colonel walking at the front with shoulders squared as if nothing had shifted while every soldier behind knew the truth, that in the heat of fire it was not his commands that had saved them but the voice and actions of the captain they trusted with their very breath, and, though no man dared say it aloud within earshot of the colonel, their silence spoke volumes, for silence too could carry loyalty. That night as the campfires flickered against the endless dark, the men gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones about the battle, replaying moments like old songs, and always their words circled back to Armin, the way he had seen the fissure when no one else had, the way he had climbed into death's teeth without hesitation, the way his presence steadied their hearts when chaos threatened to swallow them whole, and as they spoke their admiration thickened into something heavier, something close to reverence. While a few older soldiers exchanged wary glances knowing such devotion to one man was dangerous in an army where discipline demanded loyalty to rank above all else. Armin himself sat apart, his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the moon sank behind jagged hills, and though exhaustion gnawed at his bones, his mind refused rest, replaying the faces of the fallen, the screams swallowed by stone, the weight of every life he had failed to save pressing down even amidst victory, for he never measured worth by numbers spared but by names lost. Yet even under the burden of grief he held no regret, for he knew the alternative would have been far worse, 6 more graves to dig, 6 more families to mourn, and he clung to that truth as tightly as the rifle in his hands. The colonel approached him quietly, his shadow stretching long in the firelight, and the men nearby fell silent, ears straining though their eyes pretended otherwise, and when the colonel spoke his voice was low but firm, "You undermined me again, Captain. Twice now you have defied orders. You leave me no choice but to report you fully. You know what that means." Armin looked up, his expression calm though his heart thudded heavy, and replied, "I know, sir. And I will answer for it. But I will not apologize for saving lives." The colonel's eyes flashed with restrained anger, yet beneath it something else burned, something unspoken, perhaps envy or perhaps a truth too bitter to admit, that the captain's defiance had saved them all, including him. He turned abruptly, his cloak whipping behind him as he walked away, but the silence that followed his departure felt heavier than his words, for it left the men questioning not Armin but the colonel, questioning what it meant when survival itself became an act punishable by law. The days that followed stretched long and grueling as the unit pressed deeper into enemy territory, facing skirmishes and ambushes that tested every nerve, and though the colonel continued to issue orders with cold precision, it was Armin whom the men instinctively looked toward when danger flared, Armin whose calm voice steadied their aim, Armin whose presence gave them courage to hold the line, and though he never once sought their devotion, it grew with each passing moment until even the colonel could not ignore it. One evening as they prepared to cross a river swollen by rains, the colonel confronted him privately, away from the eyes and ears of the men, his voice sharp as steel. "You are becoming a threat to the chain of command. They look at you as though you are their commander. Do you understand the danger of that?" Armin met his gaze without flinching, his voice even. "I never asked for their loyalty. They give it because they believe I will not abandon them. If that is a threat, then perhaps the chain itself is weak." The colonel's fists clenched, his jaw tight, but he found no words to refute him, for deep down he knew it was true. Discipline could force obedience, but only trust could inspire sacrifice, and trust was something Armin commanded without ever demanding it. That night as rain lashed against tents and thunder rolled across the plains, the colonel sat alone with his maps, his reports, his orders, yet his mind would not rest, haunted by the sound of a single gunshot in the valley, by the sight of Armin climbing into fire, by the unwavering loyalty in the eyes of his soldiers when they looked not at him but at the man he had sworn to punish, and slowly doubt crept into his heart, a doubt that felt like betrayal to everything he had built his career upon. Meanwhile Armin walked among the men, checking wounds, sharing rations, speaking quietly to those who shivered with fear, and though his words were few they carried the weight of presence, the comfort of a leader who lived in their struggles rather than above them, and in those small gestures his bond with them deepened beyond command into brotherhood. The turning point came when the unit was ordered to take a supply convoy through Red Hollow, a narrow canyon notorious for ambushes, and though the colonel prepared his plan meticulously, Armin's instincts screamed danger, for the path was too quiet, the silence too thick, and as they entered the canyon his fears came true. Explosions ripped through the convoy, fire lighting the night as enemy forces descended from both ridges. Chaos erupted, the colonel's commands lost in the storm, and once again it was Armin who seized control, his voice rising above the roar, rallying the men into defensive positions, coordinating counterfire, moving with fearless precision through smoke and flame. The battle raged like a storm, men falling, cries echoing against stone, yet through it all Armin moved like an anchor in the chaos, steady, relentless, unyielding, and wherever he went the men followed, fighting not just to survive but to protect the bond he embodied. Hours later, when the last enemy fell and silence returned, broken only by the crackle of burning vehicles, the men looked around at one another, battered but alive, and once again their eyes found Armin, gratitude etched into every exhausted face, while the colonel stood in the shadows, speechless, watching his authority dissolve in the firelight. And though he did not speak, though he did not admit it even to himself, he knew that history would remember not his orders but the captain who had defied him, the man whose single pull of the trigger had set into motion a chain of defiance that saved more lives than discipline ever could. The wreckage of Red Hollow smoldered behind them as the unit regrouped, battered and bloodied yet still moving forward, their survival once again tied not to the colonel's carefully written strategies but to the instinct and defiance of Captain Armin, and though no one spoke of it openly in front of their commander, the truth lived in their eyes, in the way their gazes sought Armin's before the colonel's, in the way they moved with trust in his voice, and with each step further into enemy ground the silent balance of power shifted, invisible yet undeniable, a quiet revolution born not of rebellion but of gratitude and faith. The colonel, for all his pride and authority, felt it like a wound that refused to close, each glance toward Armin gnawing at the foundations of his control, for never before in his long career had he been overshadowed by another, least of all a subordinate, and though he tried to hold fast to the doctrine that discipline was the spine of the army, he could not shake the image of his soldiers clinging to the captain's presence in the fire, nor could he silence the whispering question that haunted him in the dark. What if the captain's way was not disobedience but the very essence of leadership itself? Yet to admit such a thought would unravel everything he stood for, so he buried it beneath layers of anger and silence, his heart a battlefield more chaotic than any canyon or pass they had crossed. The days stretched long as the unit pressed deeper, each mission more perilous than the last, and with every encounter Armin's actions grew in legend among the men, how he carried a wounded soldier for miles through mud without rest, how he gave up his own rations so others might eat, how he never once allowed fear to dictate his choices even when death circled close, and though Armin never sought their worship, it grew around him like fire spreading through dry grass, until even the youngest recruits spoke of him with awe, as if he were more than a man but a symbol of survival itself. The colonel watched this with tightening fists, his authority eroding with every story told, yet beneath his anger lay a reluctant respect he could not kill, for part of him, the part long buried beneath decades of rigid duty, admired the fire in Armin, admired the way he placed lives above rules, though he would never admit it aloud, not even to himself. Then came the mission that would test them beyond measure, orders to infiltrate Black Ridge, an enemy stronghold carved into cliffs, guarded by fortifications and watchtowers, a place where even seasoned units had been broken like glass, and when the colonel gathered the men to brief them, the fear was palpable, though masked beneath stoic faces, and as he spoke his strategy, detailed, rigid, precise, every ear listened, but every heart silently wondered whether Armin would see a different path. That night under a sky strewn with stars, Armin walked among the men, speaking little, his presence enough to steady them, and when one young soldier whispered through trembling lips, "Captain, will we make it out of there?" Armin placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "I cannot promise survival, but I can promise you this: I will not abandon you. Not here, not ever." Those words spread through the camp like an oath, lifting spirits even in the shadow of dread, and though he had not meant them as prophecy, they became the fuel that kept hearts from breaking. At dawn they advanced on Black Ridge, the cliffs looming like jagged teeth against the rising sun, and as they moved into position the first shots cracked, enemy fire raining down with brutal precision, turning the ridge into a cauldron of death. The colonel shouted orders, demanding formation, but the terrain shattered cohesion, explosions tearing gaps, screams cutting through the din, and in that chaos the soldiers' eyes found Armin once more, their instincts pulling toward him like iron to a magnet, for he moved not as one clinging to rule but as one breathing survival, his voice cutting through the smoke, his hand steadying the terrified, his rifle striking with relentless accuracy. Seeing the main approach was a slaughter ground, Armin's mind raced until he saw it again. A chance no one else dared take, a narrow ravine winding upward through shadows, steep and deadly but leading straight to the enemy's flank. Without hesitation he gathered a handful of volunteers, men who would follow him anywhere, and plunged into the ravine, climbing through dust and gunfire while the rest of the unit held the line. The climb was brutal, every step a war between strength and exhaustion, rocks crumbling under boots, bullets sparking off stone, but Armin drove them upward, his willpower burning hotter than the fear that clawed at their lungs. At last they emerged behind the enemy barricades, unseen until it was too late, and like a storm they struck, rifles blazing, knives flashing, chaos erupting as the defenders reeled in shock. From below the unit heard the shift, saw the enemy falter, their fire weakening, and they surged forward with renewed fury, the tide of battle turning once more not by command but by the captain who refused to bow to inevitability. Hours later when the ridge was theirs, when the last echoes of gunfire died into silence, the men stood bloodied and broken yet victorious, and as they looked around at one another, their eyes inevitably sought Armin, who stood atop the ridge, chest heaving, uniform torn, face streaked with grime, a figure not of glory but of survival. And in that moment the men cheered not out of ritual but out of raw gratitude, their voices rising like thunder, echoing across the cliffs. The colonel arrived moments later, his face pale, his silence louder than the cheers, for once again the victory bore not his mark but Armin's, and though his pride ached like a wound, even he could not deny that without the captain's reckless courage none of them would be standing. That night as the fires burned and the wounded were tended, the men told the story again and again, how their captain had led them through shadows into light, how one man's defiance had given them breath, and though Armin himself sat quietly apart, his head bowed, his thoughts heavy with the faces of the fallen, the soldiers' loyalty to him solidified into something unbreakable, something that no punishment, no order, no rank could erase. And in the deepest part of the colonel's heart, though he would not say it, he too felt the tremor of truth, that the pull of one trigger in the valley had not only saved 6 lives, it had set into motion a force greater than any authority he commanded, a force that now lived in the hearts of every man under his watch, a force that left him speechless still. The victory at Black Ridge carried the unit further into legend than any medal could, yet for Captain Armin it carried only the weight of silence, a silence filled with the names of those who had not returned, the faces that haunted him when the campfires dimmed and the laughter of survivors fell quiet, and though his men looked at him with reverence, though they whispered his name like a shield against despair, he felt no glory in their eyes, only the relentless burden of responsibility, for every cheer that lifted him also reminded him of those who would never cheer again. The colonel meanwhile remained trapped within the conflict of his own soul, torn between the iron discipline he had lived by for decades and the undeniable truth that each time survival had hung by a thread it was Armin's defiance, not his doctrine, that had held it together, and though he continued to write his reports with cold precision, listing victories under his command and minimizing the captain's role, he knew deep within that the men no longer followed him. They obeyed because they had to, but they lived because of Armin. This knowledge gnawed at him like a slow poison, and though he tried to wear his authority like armor, he felt it thinning with every passing day, every glance exchanged among soldiers, every whispered tale of the captain's courage. The unit pressed forward into the iron wastes, a barren stretch of land where the wind carried dust sharp as knives and the horizon seemed endless, and it was here, amidst desolation, that their true endurance was tested, for supplies dwindled, water grew scarce, and the enemy harried them with raids that came like shadows and vanished just as quick, leaving only blood and exhaustion behind. In those days of hunger and sleeplessness, it was not the colonel's orders that kept them moving but Armin's quiet resolve, his refusal to show weakness, his unyielding presence that reminded them they still had something worth enduring for, and though his own stomach ached with emptiness, though his body cried for rest, he gave what little he had to others, carrying them through the wasteland one weary step at a time. One night, under a sky swallowed by dust, a young soldier collapsed near the edge of camp, his body trembling from dehydration, and though the medics shook their heads, saying the boy would not last till dawn, Armin knelt beside him, cradling his head, whispering words of fire into his fading ears. "You will not give up, do you hear me? Not here, not now." Then he poured the last of his own canteen between the boy's cracked lips, ignoring the protests of those around him, and by some miracle the boy clung to life, rising days later with renewed strength, and the story spread through the ranks like a prayer, another thread binding the soldiers' hearts to the captain who bled himself dry for them. The colonel saw it all, said nothing, but the fire in his chest burned hotter, anger tangled with envy, and yet beneath it a reluctant respect whispered still, though he smothered it in silence, for to admit it aloud would shatter the iron mask he had worn his entire life. The true test came when scouts reported an enemy column advancing from the east, far larger than their battered unit, and the colonel, driven by duty to orders from command, declared they would hold their ground, fortify their position, and wait for reinforcements, but Armin's instincts screamed that reinforcements would never arrive in time, that holding ground here meant certain death, and when he voiced his concern the colonel snapped with fury, accusing him of cowardice, of undermining authority once more, his words lashing like a whip before the gathered men. Yet even as the colonel spoke, the soldiers' eyes betrayed them, flicking to Armin, silently asking what he saw, what he would do, and though Armin said nothing in defiance, the unspoken trust hung heavier than the colonel's rage. That night Armin walked the perimeter, his thoughts heavy, knowing dawn would bring slaughter if they stayed, and as he stood beneath the tattered flag that fluttered weakly against the wind, 6 men approached, the very 6 whose lives had been saved by that first trigger pull in the valley, and they looked at him with unwavering resolve, their voices low but fierce. "Captain, if you say move, we move. Even against orders." Armin's chest ached with the weight of their loyalty, for he knew what it meant, that his defiance was no longer his alone but shared by those willing to risk everything beside him, and in that moment he realized the truth. He was no longer simply a soldier, he was the keeper of their hope, and hope was more dangerous than bullets. When dawn broke and the enemy descended in waves, the colonel barked his commands, holding the line with desperate rigidity, but it was Armin who saw the flank opening, who seized the moment, rallying his men into a daring maneuver that struck the enemy where they least expected, splitting their assault and turning chaos into opportunity, and though the colonel shouted for him to return, his voice was drowned in the roar of battle, while the men followed their captain with unshakable faith. The fight was savage, blood painting the dust, screams tearing the air, yet amidst it all Armin moved like a storm, relentless and precise, his courage feeding theirs, and together they drove the enemy back, scattering them into retreat. When silence finally fell, the field was littered with bodies, both theirs and the enemy's, but against all odds the unit still stood, battered yet unbroken, and once more it was Armin whom the survivors turned to, Armin whose name they whispered like a shield against despair. The colonel stood apart, his uniform torn, his face pale, and though victory was theirs, it was hollow for him, for he knew who the men truly followed now, and the truth left him speechless still, his authority unraveling thread by thread. That night as the fires burned low and the dead were buried beneath the unforgiving dust, Armin sat among his men, listening to their quiet stories, their laughter forced but defiant, and though his heart remained heavy with grief, he felt something stir within him, not pride but purpose, the realization that perhaps his defiance was not rebellion at all but a calling greater than any order, a calling to protect not just lives but the very soul of those who fought beside him, and in that realization he found strength for the battles yet to come. The iron wastes gave way to jagged hills and forests where shadows whispered with unseen dangers, and as the unit pushed forward their strength grew thinner with every mile, yet strangely their spirit did not collapse because it clung stubbornly to the presence of Captain Armin, who bore their burdens with a quiet strength that needed no speeches. Only the steady fire in his eyes that told them he would stand between them and death as long as he breathed, and though exhaustion carved lines into their faces and hunger hollowed their cheeks, the men marched on because they believed in him more than in the strategies handed down from distant headquarters or even the orders barked by their own colonel, whose authority now felt like an echo from another life. The colonel sensed it deeply, though he never admitted it, the way his words fell on deaf ears unless Armin reinforced them, the way the soldiers carried out his commands with the motions of duty but looked to the captain for meaning, and this realization gnawed at him like rust on steel, corroding the pride that had built him into the man he was, for discipline had always been his god, and now that god was crumbling in the face of something he could neither control nor deny. Yet fate offered him no time for reflection because ahead lay the blood plains, an expanse infamous for battles so savage that the soil itself seemed stained with centuries of spilled blood, and it was here that the enemy had gathered their strongest force, a wall of steel and fury determined to break them once and for all. When the scouts returned with news of the encampment ahead, the colonel gathered his men and laid out a plan as rigid as the ones before. Advance in formation, divide into flanks, strike the enemy head-on with discipline and timing, and though his voice carried the authority of rank, the men's silence betrayed their doubt, their eyes drifting toward Armin as if silently asking what his vision saw. Armin said nothing then, his gaze fixed on the horizon where smoke curled like dark omens, but inside he wrestled with fire, knowing that a frontal assault would mean walking into slaughter, yet also knowing that to defy again would push the fragile thread between him and the colonel to breaking, a thread already frayed by every past defiance. That night as the men prepared for battle, sharpening blades, whispering farewells into the dirt, Armin walked among them, his presence as steady as ever though his mind churned, and when he paused at the fire where the 6 men he had first saved all those weeks ago now sat, they looked up at him with the same unwavering faith as always, and one of them said, "Captain, whatever happens tomorrow we'll follow you." The words burned into his heart, heavy yet strengthening, for they reminded him that leadership was not about orders given but about promises kept, and he vowed silently that he would keep that promise again no matter the cost. When dawn broke red across the plains, the enemy surged forward with a roar like thunder, their numbers a tide of bodies and steel, and the colonel shouted for the unit to hold formation, but the first wave shattered them like glass, the ground trembling with explosions, the air torn by screams, and in that instant Armin knew that if he did not act the field would become their grave. He raised his rifle, his voice slicing through chaos with the force of certainty, calling the men to shift, to move with the terrain, to use the ridges and gullies as shields, and though it meant abandoning the colonel's formation, the soldiers obeyed without hesitation, flowing into his vision as if it were instinct carved into their bones. The colonel raged, shouting against the tide, but his words were drowned by the roar of survival, and when he turned to see his men fighting with precision under Armin's direction, something inside him cracked, something that had clung stubbornly to control even as it bled away. Armin led from the front, charging into the storm, his rifle spitting fire, his commands sharp and clear, every movement calculated not for glory but for survival, and wherever he moved the enemy faltered, their lines breaking under the weight of his defiance, while his men surged with him like waves pulled by a tide. Hours stretched into eternity, the plains soaked with blood, the air choked with smoke, and yet through it all the soldiers held because Armin refused to let them fall, his body battered, his uniform torn, his arms heavy with exhaustion, yet his spirit unyielding, burning like a beacon in the heart of hell. At one point he found himself face to face with an enemy officer, a man towering with rage, sword raised to strike, and though Armin was nearly spent he met the blow with ferocity, grappling in the mud until with one desperate surge he drove his blade home, collapsing beside the fallen foe but rising again with grit carved deeper than pain. His men saw this, their cheers rising even amidst carnage, and they fought with renewed fury, every heartbeat tied to their captain's unrelenting defiance. When at last the enemy broke and fled, leaving the plains littered with their dead, the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged breaths of survivors, and as the men stood amidst the ruin, bloodied but alive, their eyes turned not to the colonel but to Armin, whose chest heaved, whose hands trembled, but whose gaze still carried the fire that had carried them through. The colonel approached slowly, his face pale, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, for how could he deny the truth written in blood across the plains, that it was not his plan, not his discipline, but Armin's defiance that had delivered them again. He stood there for a long moment, speechless, while his men surrounded the captain with gratitude so raw it could not be silenced, and in that moment the colonel knew his command was hollow, that history would not remember the orders he gave but the man who saved them by breaking them. That night as fires flickered weakly across the devastated plains, the men gathered around Armin, their voices low, telling the story already as if it were legend, how one man had turned certain death into survival, and though Armin himself sat quietly, his face shadowed by grief for the fallen, he knew deep within that the burden he carried had become something larger, something beyond himself, a burden of hope that no punishment, no law, no chain of command could erase. The days after the blood plains were heavy with silence, the kind that clung to the skin and pressed into the lungs, for though they had survived, though their victory was undeniable, the cost hung like smoke that would never clear, and as the men buried their dead in shallow graves marked with broken rifles, they did so with hands that trembled from exhaustion yet hearts that still beat with the fragile strength of survival, and at the center of it all was Captain Armin, whose own body bore wounds deep and unseen though he never let them show, moving among the men with the same steady presence that had carried them through the storm, speaking little but offering a hand on a shoulder, a nod of reassurance, a gaze that told them they were not alone. The colonel watched from a distance, his pride shattered, his authority a hollow shell, and though he tried to remind himself that he still held the rank, still bore the title of commander, he could no longer ignore the truth that had been carved into the battlefield. His orders had failed, his discipline had broken, and only Armin's defiance had kept them breathing. That realization did not stir anger in him now, not as it once had, but something different, something he had not felt in years. Humility, a recognition that the strength he had worshipped in rules and commands was nothing compared to the living fire of faith and loyalty that the captain had inspired. Days stretched into weeks as they pushed on toward the border, their mission no longer about conquest but simply about survival, each step a test of endurance, and though the men were weary they carried themselves with a strange pride, the kind born from knowing they had faced death and refused to yield, and always their eyes sought Armin, as though his presence alone was enough to keep them upright when their legs wanted to buckle. He spoke little of what he felt inside, the guilt for those he had lost, the weight of lives that clung to his conscience. But at night when the campfires burned low and the men drifted to restless sleep, he would sit in silence, staring at the stars, whispering the names of the fallen into the vastness above, promising he would carry them forever. The colonel, too, found himself restless in those nights, but unlike before, when he would have seethed with bitterness, now he lingered on the edges of the camp, watching the man he had once condemned as reckless and disobedient, realizing at last that it was not rebellion that defined him but sacrifice, that his trigger pull on that first day had not been an act of defiance against authority but an act of love for the men he refused to abandon. And slowly, though the words came hard, the colonel began to change, his commands softening, his anger fading, and in rare moments he even sought Armin's counsel, though he did so quietly, almost ashamed, as if admitting aloud that the captain had been right all along would unravel what little pride he had left. Yet the men noticed, and with every passing day their respect for Armin grew while their bitterness toward the colonel eased, for they saw in his silence a man learning at last what it meant to serve rather than command, and in some strange way that, too, became part of the story they carried forward. Their journey neared its end when they reached the river that marked the edge of the contested land, but before they could cross, the enemy struck one final time, a desperate assault meant to crush them before they escaped, and once more chaos exploded around them, bullets tearing the air, blades flashing in the dark. Armin moved instinctively, rallying the men, pulling them into a defensive line, his voice cutting through the night like steel, and though the enemy came with the fury of desperation, the unit fought with the unbreakable bond of survivors who had already faced hell and refused to surrender. The colonel, too, fought beside them this time, not behind but among, his weapon in his hands, his voice raw with shouts of defiance, and for the first time the men saw him not as a figure of command but as a soldier willing to bleed beside them. The battle was brutal, the riverbank slick with blood, but at last the enemy broke, retreating into the night, leaving behind silence once more, and as dawn rose over the water, painting the sky with the colors of survival, the unit stood battered but alive, and in that moment they knew their war was over, at least for now. The colonel turned to Armin, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, and for a long moment the two men simply stared at each other, the weight of everything that had passed between them pressing down, until at last the colonel's lips parted, and with a voice hoarse but steady he said words none of the men would ever forget. "You were right. It was never me. It was always you." And with those words the silence that had bound him for so long broke, leaving him not diminished but strangely lighter, for in admitting the truth he had fought hardest against, he found a measure of peace. Armin said nothing, only bowed his head slightly, for he did not seek glory or recognition, only the knowledge that his men had lived, and around him the soldiers cheered, not for victory, not for medals, but for life itself, for the bond they had forged, for the captain who had saved them again and again by daring to choose humanity over obedience. When at last they crossed the river and returned to safer ground, they carried with them no banners, no grand parades, only scars and stories, and those stories spread like fire, whispered from camp to camp, from soldier to soldier, until they became legend, the tale of the captain whose single pull of a trigger had saved 6 lives and begun a chain of defiance that saved countless more, a tale that left even the colonel himself speechless. And though Armin lived quietly after, never chasing recognition, never seeking to be remembered, the men who had followed him carried his name in their hearts like a prayer, knowing that without him they would have been nothing more than forgotten graves on distant battlefields, and in that way his story endured, not in medals or records, but in the unbreakable bond of lives saved by one man's refusal to surrender, a bond that time itself could never erase. The end.